Next on our World Future Energy Summit special, we're looking into the future of aviation energy and the move towards biofuels, backed by a recent announcement by the likes of Etihad Airways, Boeing and Masdar.
I met up with the Managing Director of Environmental Strategy and Innovation at Boeing Commercial Airplanes, Julie Felger, and I began by asking her just how safe biofuels are for commercial air travel.
They're absolutely just as safe. In fact, Boeing's number one concern with everything related to our airplanes is safety. All the biofuels will go through an approval system, a worldwide approval system. In fact, some of them have been approved for flight today, and there should be no concern from passengers.
And in terms of flights, when will we see them up and running with this new biofuels?
Well, we've already had over 1,500 flights to date. Some of those have been test flights, and some of them are regularly scheduled commercial flights today.
Now tell me, how are biofuels grown in the UAE? I know you've been working with Masdar for some time now.
Yes.
Can it be environmentally friendly? Can we ensure that they're not using the gas-powered desalination plants, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're working on within the UAE with Etihad and Masdar Institute are called halophytes, which are saltwater tolerant plants. And at the basis of everything that we're doing around biofuels is sustainable aviation biofuels. So in the end, that means that we're not competing for water, we're not competing for food, and we have a lower carbon life cycle on the fuels than fossil fuels today. So for the halophytes, we're looking at growing and seeing if we can go to commercial scale on growing halophytes, and you use salt water to irrigate them, and then that salt water naturally goes into mangrove forests that are around today.
Making sure you don't have to rely on the desal. What
That's
about
right.
the financial side for the halophytes?
Well, right now we're at the point where we're at research. We haven't gone to commercial scale yet. That's what we need to prove over the next couple of years, and that's more long term. So probably 5 to 10 year time horizon.
But do you eventually see that as being a financially viable option as well? Because that's one of the big problems with biofuels we often hear is the financial cost.
Right. Well, what we found that today we've made an announcement earlier this week related to green diesel. And green diesel is at price parity today with Jet A, and it's available at around 800 million gallons refining capacity today. Into the future that we're looking at an all-of-the-above strategy with biofuels. Halophytes is one of those pathways that we're looking at, and we're going to aim to go to commercial viability because that's what our airline customers need. They need fuels that cost the same, and they'll prefer biofuels when we can get to that price parity because of the lower carbon emissions.
Yes, as long as ticket prices don't go up, I think tends to be a priority
Yeah.
still. What about the pros and cons of biofuels as a whole? Are you finding that many carriers are getting on board? Obviously you mentioned Etihad, but what other companies?
Well, we have a group called the Sustainable Aviation Fuels Users Group that represents around 33% of today's fuel purchase around the world, airlines. So airlines like KLM, GOL in Brazil, British Airways, GEL and ANA in Japan, Qantas in Australia. So worldwide there's a huge commitment towards driving towards sustainable aviation biofuels.
What about some of the downside though? We often hear that forests are being cleared to make way for biofuels, that often they're being used to grow these biofuels for fuel rather than using it for food. How do you deal with those kind of critics?
Well, we learned a lot of lessons from the first generation of biofuels. One that's most common to people is ethanol, right? So we learned not to go down that route. In all of the stakeholder processes that we've been doing around the world, we engage NGOs up front in the process to make sure that we're using feedstocks that don't compete with crops, they don't compete with food, they don't compete with land, and they're good for both the social and the economic benefits of the societies around them.
In terms of making biofuels a major part of the jet fuel industry today, I spoke to Emirates' Tim Clark a few years ago. He said it would be a very long time before we saw something like that. I think it's currently around 3% of the transportation market. Where do you see it taking us? Is it long term? Is it more of a stopgap until we find better technology?
Well, Boeing set a goal internally, actually. The aviation industry has set a goal that by 2020 we're going to be carbon neutral, and that by 2050 we're going to reduce our carbon footprint by 50%. That's based on a 2005 timeline. Boeing set a goal that by 2016 we wanted to see 1% of the aviation fuel market represented by biofuels. We made an announcement earlier this week related to green diesel that there's around 800 million gallons of refining capacity today. That is over 1% of jet fuel. And we're moving that through the approvals process. Now that 1% is always the hardest percent to get. So I think that we're on a good path, and I see that a 5 to 10 year horizon, we'll hopefully get to where we want to be.
Why is the 1% always the hardest to get?
Because there's so much learning that goes on in the 1%. If you look at the electronics industry or the consumables industries, you spend so much of your time doing the research and the learning and understanding the economics and in that 1%. And once you learn all of that, then it's just a downhill slide from that point on.
Now finally, more generally, when it comes to, I guess, the life cycle of a plane, I think you called it the end service earlier, what's Boeing doing to make sure they're maximising reuse, recycling of the planes?
Yeah. So what we see in the world over the next 20 years is a doubling of the airline fleet. Over 40% of that is going to be replacement airplanes, which means airplanes are coming out of service and new airplanes are being put into service. So what we're really starting to do now is take a look at what we call the end of service and how we can take those airplanes apart and recycle and reuse as much of the components and the materials in those airplanes. We're also looking at sustainable materials that we can use today in new airplanes. So for the galleyways and for the backs of seats, what type of materials can we use that have been repurposed to put in the airplane?